There is a rule in modern warfare that every officer learns before he commands a single soldier. You do not move armored columns in daylight when the enemy owns the sky. This is not theory. This is not doctrine written by men who have never smelled cordite. This is the lesson that every campaign from Poland to Stalingrad had confirmed in blood and steel. Daylight movement without air cover is suicide. Every general who survived the early war years knew this. Every staff officer who had read the after-action reports knew this. By the summer of 1944, the Wehrmacht had some of the finest combat veterans on earth. Men who had crossed the Meuse in 1940, frozen at Moscow in 1941, retreated across North Africa in 1943. Men who had absorbed punishment that would have broken lesser armies and come back to fight again. They knew terrain. They knew combined arms. They knew how to hold a position with a fraction of the force their enemy expected. What they did not know, what the German High Command in France had convinced itself it understood but had catastrophically underestimated, was what happened when several thousand American aircraft decided that every road in Normandy was a target. This is not a story about air power in the abstract. This is about what it looked like from the ground, from the foxhole, from the command post being strafed while a general tried to read a map. It is about the field reports and private accounts that German officers wrote during the summer and autumn of 1944. Reports that their superiors in Berlin sometimes refused to believe, sometimes suppressed, and sometimes simply filed away because the truth they contained was too catastrophic to process. The truth was this: the American Air Forces had built something in the skies over France that the Wehrmacht had never faced before and had no real answer to. And the officers who wrote home, who submitted their battle assessments, who stood in ruined headquarters and dictated to their adjutants while fighter bombers circled overhead like patient hawks, said so in language that stripped away every layer of professional military understatement. They wrote about it the way soldiers write about things that have broken something inside them, carefully, honestly, with the particular precision of men who know that what they are describing is not going to be believed. If this kind of forgotten military history is something you want more of, subscribe before we go further. These accounts sat in archives and post-war interrogation files for decades. They deserve better than silence. To understand what the German officers were writing about, you need to understand what they were facing. By June 1944, the United States 9th Air Force had deployed the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt in a role that its designers had never fully anticipated. The aircraft was enormous by fighter standards, weighing over 7 tons loaded, powered by a 2,000 horsepower radial engine that sounded, according to more than one German soldier's account, like the sky itself tearing apart. It carried 8 50 caliber machine guns, could haul 1,000 pounds of bombs, and had been fitted with rockets capable of penetrating tank armor. It was not elegant. German pilots who had flown against early P-47s had called them flying barrels, fat American machines with no business in the same sky as a Focke-Wulf. Major Joseph Priller of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm admitted later that his pilots had laughed at the Thunderbolt in 1943. They stopped laughing in Normandy. The P-47's combination of ruggedness, firepower, and range made it the perfect instrument for what Allied commanders called armed reconnaissance, which was the military's way of describing aircraft going out to kill anything that moved on a French road. A Thunderbolt hit by anti-aircraft fire that would have downed a more delicate aircraft could often absorb the damage and keep flying. German anti-aircraft crews learned quickly that the aircraft they needed to destroy was often still functional after taking hits that would have been fatal to almost anything else. And there were thousands of them. By the time of the Normandy breakout, American and British tactical air forces could put hundreds of sorties over the battlefield on a clear day. The numbers were not abstract. German commanders felt them in very concrete ways. The first German officer whose account threads through everything that happened in the summer of 1944 is Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division. Bayerlein was not an ordinary officer. He had served under Guderian in Poland and France, had been Rommel's chief of staff in North Africa, had commanded a division on the Eastern Front, and broken out of a Soviet encirclement at Kirovograd against Hitler's direct orders. He had fought in every major German theater. He was 45 years old in June 1944. He had seen everything that modern warfare had to offer. What he encountered on the road to Normandy on June 7, 1944, was something he had not seen before. Panzer Lehr was among the finest divisions in the entire German order of battle. Its name meant Demonstration Division, built from instructors and veterans specifically to showcase German armored capability. It had 237 tanks and assault guns. Its Panzer Grenadiers had their own armored half-tracks, and every battalion commander was an officer of exceptional quality. Bayerlein drove it north from its assembly area near Chartres after receiving orders on D-Day evening to move immediately to the front near Caen. 100 miles. Bayerlein asked permission to move at night to avoid air attack. He was told to move now. What happened over the next 24 hours was recorded in German after-action reports with a specificity that makes for uncomfortable reading even now. Allied fighter bombers attacked the division's columns continuously. Not once, not twice. Continuously. Every vehicle that moved on a road was a target. Every road leading toward Normandy was, as Bayerlein would later describe it in a phrase that became famous among German veterans, a Jabo-Rennstrecke, a fighter-bomber racecourse. Before Panzer Lehr reached the front, it had lost 84 half-tracks and self-propelled guns, 5 tanks, and 130 trucks. Not to enemy ground forces, to aircraft. Before a single shot had been fired in the defensive battle Panzer Lehr was supposed to fight. Bayerlein's division had been bled before it arrived. And this was only the beginning. The reports coming up through the German command chain in June and July 1944 tell a story that becomes repetitive, not because the writers lack imagination, but because the same thing kept happening. Bodo Zimmermann, Lieutenant General of Army Group D's operations staff, put it in a single sentence that appeared in internal documents from this period. No road movement by day was possible under the air umbrella. 6 words. Simple, direct, and describing a situation that had made German mobile warfare in France essentially impossible during daylight hours. Rommel himself had been warning about this before the invasion. In the months leading up to June 6th, he had argued persistently that Allied air superiority would make large-scale tank movements impossible once the fighting started. Other German commanders had thought him excessively pessimistic. Rundstedt and the tank theorists wanted to hold the Panzer divisions back in reserve for a decisive counterattack, the classic German operational method. Rommel said this was a fantasy because the reserves would never reach the front in time. He was correct in a way that proved worse than even he had predicted. On June 10th, 4 days after the landings, Rommel sent a communication to Führer headquarters that is among the most direct assessments any German field marshal wrote during the entire war. Air superiority has a very grave effect on our movements, he reported. There is simply no answer to it. 5 weeks later, American Spitfires strafed his staff car on the road near Leverott. Rommel suffered 4 fractures of the skull. He was out of the war. The report he had written proved prophetic in the most personal way possible. The German officer corps, to its credit, did not pretend this was not happening. The field reports from June and July 1944 are not documents of denial. They are documents of men trying to describe to their superiors, as precisely as professional soldiers can, the nature of a problem that had no solution within the resources available to them. The issue was not courage. German soldiers in Normandy fought with extraordinary tenacity. The issue was mobility. An army that cannot move its reserves, cannot resupply its forward units, cannot rotate its exhausted troops, cannot use all that courage effectively. And the American Air Forces had made movement a matter of darkness or death. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel takes these stories seriously. Every detail in this script comes from primary source material and documented accounts. If that matters to you, subscribe and share. You'll be helping us tell more of them. By mid-July, the German army in Normandy was functionally a static force. Divisions that had been designed around the concept of fast armored maneuver, the Blitzkrieg doctrine that had conquered France in 6 weeks 4 years earlier, were digging into hedgerows and moving their tanks at night by single vehicles along routes chosen specifically to avoid the roads that American aircraft watched constantly. Supply trucks moved in darkness. Ammunition arrived in darkness. Wounded soldiers were evacuated in darkness. The German army in France had become a nocturnal creature, and every sunrise brought a new inventory of what had been destroyed while someone else's planes owned the sky. The accounts from individual soldiers during this period complement the command-level reports in ways that give them texture. A German signals officer named Walter Kruger, retreating with the 12th SS Panzer Division during the formation of the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, described watching an entire column catch fire around him as Allied aircraft worked it over. "Then I saw that the whole column was on fire," he said afterward. "Everybody was running." There is no military language in that. It is simply a man describing what he saw. The Falaise Pocket itself was the culmination of what the German field reports had been predicting since June. After Hitler ordered a counterattack at Mortain in early August that pushed German armored forces westward into a forming Allied encirclement, the Wehrmacht found itself trapped in a pocket with Allied aircraft patrolling every escape route. The roads leading east through the pocket were, in the words of Allied soldiers who saw them after the battle was over, an image that requires no embellishment. General Eisenhower himself, touring the battlefield after the pocket closed, said it was possible to walk for hundreds of yards, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. The numbers give that scene its military context. In the northern sector alone, German losses included 344 tanks and armored vehicles, more than 2,400 soft-skinned vehicles, and 252 artillery pieces abandoned or destroyed. 10,000 German soldiers were killed. 50,000 were taken prisoner. The formations that escaped east did so without their equipment, without their vehicles, without the organizational structure that had made them fighting units. A German division that arrived at the West Wall in September 1944 might carry the name and some of the men of the force that had crossed into France in June, but it was a different institution from the one that had gone in. The equipment was gone. The officers were gone. The irreplaceable, experienced sergeants who know what to do without being told, they were gone too. General von Kluge, who had replaced Rundstedt as commander of German forces in the West and who had then replaced the wounded Rommel as commander of Army Group B simultaneously, recognized the catastrophe forming around him with a clarity that his communications to Hitler document in painful detail. He had arrived in France in July, convinced that his predecessors had been defeatist, that energetic leadership could solve problems that Rundstedt and Rommel had described as insoluble. By August, he was writing reports that sounded like the ones he had dismissed weeks earlier. He requested permission to withdraw from the forming pocket. Hitler initially refused. The withdrawal that finally came was too late. Kluge was removed from command on August 17th. Driving alone toward Germany after his relief, he took potassium cyanide near Metz. He had been suspected of involvement in the July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler. His death was not mourned by the regime he had served. His field reports from those final weeks, however, are among the most honest documents produced by any senior German officer during the entire Normandy campaign. He had looked at what the American air forces were doing to his army and written about it with a directness that his predecessors had rarely managed. The reports from Bayerlein during this same period reach a kind of climax in late July that almost defies professional military language. On July 25, 1944, Operation Cobra began. The American breakout from Normandy had been preceded by aerial bombardment on a scale that even veterans of the Eastern Front had difficulty processing. Over 1,500 American heavy bombers, B-17S and B-24S from the 8th Air Force, dropped bombs in a carpet pattern on German positions along the Saint-Lô-Perrier Road. Bayerlein and Panzer Lehr were positioned directly beneath the bomb run. What Bayerlein said afterward in post-war interrogation was recorded by American officers who noted that he seemed, even years later, to be describing something he was still trying to understand. The bombers came, he said, like a conveyor belt. Back and forth, the bomb carpets were laid. Artillery positions were destroyed. Tanks were overturned. Infantry positions were simply erased. By midday, the ground outside Saint-Lô resembled a moonscape, bomb craters touching rim to rim. All communications were severed. Command was impossible. Some of his men went mad and ran in the open until they were cut down by fragments. Over 70% of his personnel were dead, wounded, shell-shocked, or too dazed to function. A day later, when an emissary arrived from von Klug's headquarters with orders that not a single man was to leave his position, Bayerlein gave the emissary a reply that has been quoted in German military history with regularity ever since. He said that everyone in the front lines was indeed holding their ground. His grenadiers, his engineers, his tank crews, every one of them was in their position. Not a single man was leaving his post. They were lying in their foxholes, mute and silent, because they were dead. Dead. He asked the emissary to report to the field marshal that the Panzer Lehr Division was annihilated. Only the dead can now hold the line. That sentence, "Only the dead can now hold the line," written in the field reports and preserved in post-war accounts. It is the clearest expression of what American air power had done to one of the finest armored divisions Germany possessed in the summer of 1944. An elite formation, built from the Army's best instructors and equipped with its best weapons, ground to nothing not by superior German armor or infantry, but by aircraft. By thousands of young men from Texas and Ohio and Pennsylvania who had learned to fly, climbed into P-47s and B-17s and gone to work on every road and every position and every vehicle that moved in daylight. The German accounts from the weeks after Cobra share a quality that is easier to feel than to describe. They are written by men who have stopped arguing about what should be done. The arguments about where to station the panzer reserves, whether Rommel or Rundstedt had been right about defensive strategy, whether the counterattack at Mortain might still work, all of that is over. What remains in the reports is a kind of bleak inventory. What we have lost, what we will not be able to replace. The language of men who have been running the calculations and arrived at an answer they do not want to report. Bayerlein survived the war. He was captured in the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945. The Americans, with characteristic efficiency, then asked him to write down everything he knew about Panzer Lehr's operations in Normandy for the U.S. Army Historical Division. He cooperated completely. The manuscripts he produced, along with similar accounts from hundreds of other German officers in American captivity, became the Foreign Military Studies series that historians have been drawing on ever since. Bayerlein described what had happened to his division with the same honesty he had shown in his wartime reports. He was not trying to excuse failure or blame others. He was trying to explain to an American audience who deserved accurate answers how a first-rate German armored division had been destroyed in France. The conclusion his accounts point toward is one that military historians have been discussing for 80 years without fully resolving. How much of Germany's defeat in Normandy was attributable to Allied air power specifically, as opposed to the weight of Allied materiel overall, the quality of Allied generalship, the errors of German command? The numbers from the after-action analyses conducted after the campaign are more nuanced than the field reports suggest. Allied investigators examining German armor losses in Normandy found that approximately 65% had been destroyed by Allied tanks or anti-tank weapons, while aircraft accounted for roughly 10% directly. The remaining 25% had been abandoned, run out of fuel, or broken down. Those numbers would seem to diminish the air power story, but German officers who read them after the war consistently argued that they missed the larger point. The direct destruction of tanks was not what the aircraft had done to the German army. What they had done was make the army immobile. The 25% of vehicles abandoned and broken down represented formations that could not receive fuel or spare parts because those supplies could not move in daylight. The 65% destroyed by Allied ground forces represented battles fought by German units that could not be reinforced or resupplied because the roads were under constant air attack. Remove the air umbrella, the German officers argued in their post-war manuscripts, and the entire balance of the campaign changes. Not necessarily in Germany's favor, but changes. The German command understood this in real time, which is why the field reports have the tone they have. Rommel's June 10th message, "There is simply no answer to it," was not a momentary expression of pessimism. It was a professional assessment that his colleagues who lived longer would eventually confirm. There was no answer to it within the resources available to Germany and France in 1944. The Luftwaffe could not contest Allied air superiority. The anti-aircraft artillery was inadequate in both quantity and caliber. The army could not wait for darkness forever. and when it moved in daylight it paid prices that the replacement system could not cover. The German soldiers who moved through France in the summer and autumn of 1944 were, by any reasonable measure, still formidable fighters. The records show this. American units repeatedly encountered stubborn resistance from formations that should, by their attrition rates, have had nothing left to offer. The capacity for tactical improvisation that had characterized the Wehrmacht at its peak did not simply vanish at Normandy, but improvisation at the tactical level could not compensate for strategic paralysis. An army that had to route all of its thinking through the question of whether this movement is possible in daylight is an army that has already surrendered the initiative. The field reports written by German officers in France in 1944 are military documents. They are written in the compressed professional language of men trained to describe facts and recommend actions. But if you read enough of them, a pattern emerges that is almost literary in its consistency. The reports from June express concern, urgency, requests for resources that were not available. The reports from July express something closer to resignation, the tone of men who have requested the same thing several times and stopped expecting them to arrive. The reports from August, the ones written from the shrinking Falaise Pocket with aircraft overhead and Allied armies closing on three sides, have the quality of testimony rather than operational assessment. Men recording what they saw because someone should know it happened. They wrote about an enemy they had underestimated not in courage or numbers, though both of those had been misjudged, but in this specific capacity. The capacity to make the sky into a weapon that followed you everywhere. That made a road a target. That made a supply column an invitation. That turned daylight itself from a tactical asset into a liability. There is a monument at St. Lo now. The city was nearly destroyed in the fighting of 1944, and the ruins of the church tower were preserved as a permanent memorial to the cost of liberation. The fields around it still yield fragments of metal when farmers plow deep enough. The craters have long since filled in, and the moonscape that Bayerlein described in July 1944 is now pasture and hedgerow again. The war has been absorbed into the landscape the way wars eventually are, but the reports exist. In archives in Washington and Freiburg and London, the accounts that German officers wrote when they were trying to explain to themselves and to whoever would read their words what had happened to an army that had conquered Europe and been unable to move a truck in daylight through a French country road. Bayerlein died in Würzburg in January 1970. He had outlived most of his contemporaries, outlived the division he had commanded, outlived the regime he had served. He spent his last years working with historians, answering questions, writing essays about armored warfare for journals that found his expertise valuable even decades after the events he was describing. When asked about Normandy, he spoke about it with the particular precision of a man who has thought about something for 25 years and arrived at clarity. He said his division was destroyed not by infantry, not by superior German armor, but by aircraft and by the system of war those aircraft represented. A manufacturing capacity, a training program, a supply chain, a command philosophy that produced thousands of aircraft and thousands of pilots and put them over France every day until there was nothing left to oppose them. He said this without bitterness, which is the part that makes it worth remembering. He had been a soldier. He had faced soldiers who were better equipped and better supported and had lost to them honestly. The field reports he had written during the campaign had said the same thing in the compressed language that military documents require. The post-war accounts said it more plainly. The message was consistent. The P-47 destroyed nearly 9,000 trains and 86,000 trucks during the war in Europe. Those are aggregate numbers that span campaigns and theaters. In Normandy specifically, they translated into something more human and more consequential. They translated into a German army that had to think about the sky before it could think about the enemy in front of it. An army that had built its doctrine around speed and surprise, discovering that speed requires roads you can use and surprise requires movement you can conceal. Both had been taken away by something the German High Command in France did not have a tactical answer for and did not have the resources to contest. The field reports said so. The letters home said so. The post-war accounts confirmed it with the additional clarity that survival sometimes provides. An enemy that cannot move cannot fight the way it was trained to fight, and an enemy that is watching P-47s circle overhead at first light while trying to read a map in a farmhouse command post, has already begun to lose something that firepower and determination cannot replace. The summer of 1944 in France belongs, in the broad historical narrative, to names and dates and battles. D-Day and Cobra and Falaise, Eisenhower and Patton and Montgomery. What the German field reports add to that narrative is something the official histories sometimes soften: the view from the other side of the sky. The experience of an army that was not broken by a single battle or a superior commander, but by a persistent, methodical, daily campaign to make every road a target and every daylight movement a gamble that the numbers increasingly did not favor. Rommel had said there was simply no answer to it. Bayerlein had watched his finest division converted into a moonscape in a single morning. The soldiers who made it out of the Falaise Pocket did so in darkness, on foot, leaving their vehicles burning on roads that had become race courses for aircraft. The reports they wrote are still there, sitting in archives, waiting for the people who find this kind of truth worth the time it takes to locate it. If this story deserved your attention, that like button tells us to keep going. We research every one of these accounts from primary sources. We believe the men who wrote these reports, German and Allied alike, deserve to have their words treated with the seriousness they earned in the worst conditions either side ever faced. Subscribe and help us make sure they get it.